May 12, 1945, Burg Lengenfeld, Bavaria. As the morning fog lifted over the Naab River Valley, revealing the medieval stone buildings now pockmarked with artillery damage, Frau Helga Zimmermann watched with narrowed eyes as the American soldiers unloaded their trucks. The war had been over for just 5 days, and already these foreign occupiers were establishing themselves in what remained of her town. What caught her attention today was particularly strange. Several Negro soldiers were carrying large burlap sacks filled with what appeared to be dried yellow kernels. Probably more of their strange American supplies, she muttered to herself, as she adjusted the threadbare scarf covering her graying blonde hair. "What do you think they're bringing now?" asked her neighbor, Greta Weber, a thin woman with hollow cheeks who had lost her husband at Stalingrad 3 years earlier. "Who knows what these people eat?" Helga replied, watching as the black soldiers, members of the segregated 761st Tank Battalion, began distributing the sacks among themselves. "The Americans have everything while we starve." Before they could continue their speculation, they would be proven dramatically wrong about many things they thought they knew. The American occupation would reveal not only the vast material superiority of the Allied forces, but would challenge fundamental beliefs about race, culture, and even something as basic as what constituted proper human food. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how corn, a simple grain Americans took for granted, became an unexpected instrument of cultural exchange that would force German civilians to confront their preconceptions about both their American occupiers and their own place in the post-war world order. First Lieutenant James Washington of the 761st Black Panthers Tank Battalion surveyed the small Bavarian town from the back of his supply truck. At 28 years old, he had already seen more combat than most men would in a lifetime. His unit had fought its way across France and into Germany, earning a distinguished unit citation and the respect of General Patton himself, who had initially opposed the deployment of black combat units. Now, in the strange limbo between war and peace, Washington found himself assigned to occupation duty in this rural corner of Bavaria. "Corporal Davis, let's get these supplies distributed to the men," Washington called out to his supply officer. "Make sure everyone gets their fair share." Corporal Henry Davis, a 22-year-old from Georgia, nodded and began organizing the distribution. The sacks contained dried corn kernels, a recent arrival from America that supplemented their regular rations. To the men of the 761st, many of whom had grown up in the rural South, corn was a welcome taste of home. "Yes, sir," Davis replied. "The boys will be happy to see this instead of more K rations." He paused, noticing the group of German women watching them from across the street. "Looks like we've got an audience." Washington glanced over. "They're probably just curious. Can't blame them. Most of them have probably never seen black soldiers before." "Or any soldiers who aren't half-starved," added Davis. "Did you see those Wehrmacht prisoners they brought through yesterday? Looking like scarecrows in uniforms." Washington nodded grimly. The contrast between American forces and what remained of the German military was stark, a physical manifestation of the industrial might that had ultimately won the war. While German forces had fought fiercely, their equipment had grown increasingly outdated and scarce as the conflict progressed. By comparison, American troops were well-fed, well-equipped, and backed by seemingly endless supplies. "Lieutenant Washington," called out Technical Sergeant Marcus Johnson as he approached. Johnson, a 25-year-old from Chicago, had been a mechanic before the war and now kept the unit's tanks running. "Colonel has asked for you, something about meeting with the Burgermeister this afternoon." Washington sighed. "All right, Davis, finish up here. Johnson, you're with me." As they walked toward headquarters, a requisitioned town hall that had somehow escaped serious damage, Washington spotted another group of locals watching them. Among them was a young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, perhaps in her early 20s. Unlike the older women who regarded the Americans with suspicion, she seemed genuinely curious. "What's your assessment of the locals, Sergeant?" Washington asked. Johnson considered the question. "Hard to tell, sir. Some seem relieved the fighting's over. Others look at us like we're from another planet." He lowered his voice. "Especially when they see black faces. You can see they don't know what to make of us." Washington understood. The Germans had been subjected to years of propaganda about American racial tensions, much of it designed to portray the United States as hypocritical for fighting against Nazi racial ideologies while maintaining segregation at home. It wasn't entirely wrong. The irony wasn't lost on the black soldiers fighting for freedoms abroad that they were denied at home. But the Nazi propaganda had also portrayed black Americans as barely civilized, a notion that the professional conduct of units like the 761st directly contradicted. "Just maintain discipline," Washington replied. "Our actions speak louder than their propaganda ever could." As they passed by the group, Washington nodded politely. The young blonde woman seemed startled by the acknowledgement, but gave a hesitant nod in return. Later that afternoon, as Lieutenant Washington sat in the meeting with the local burgomaster and other American officers, he found his mind wandering to the food situation. The war had devastated German agriculture, and reports indicated that many civilians were subsisting on less than 1,000 calories per day, barely enough to survive. The American occupation forces had orders to prevent starvation, but not to coddle the former enemy. "The civilians need more food," the burgomaster, a thin man named Hoffman, who had only taken the position after the Nazi officials fled, was saying. "The children especially. Many are showing signs of malnutrition." Colonel Richard Jenkins, the American officer in charge of the district, nodded. "We'll continue distributing emergency rations as they become available, but you understand that there are shortages throughout Europe. Germany isn't being singled out for hardship." Washington cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may, my unit received a shipment of dried corn. We could spare some for the civilian population." Jenkins looked skeptical. "Lieutenant, those are supplemental rations for your men." "Yes, sir, but we've received more than we need, and most Germans aren't familiar with preparing corn. It might be a good opportunity to—" He paused, searching for the right words. "To build some goodwill." The colonel considered this. "Very well, Washington. Your unit can share some of its corn allotment with the civilians, but make sure your men don't go without." "Thank you, sir," Washington replied, already formulating a plan. The next morning, Maria Hoffman, the 23-year-old daughter of the burgomaster, was helping distribute turnips at the town's makeshift food distribution center when she saw several American trucks pull up. To her surprise, it was the black soldiers again, led by the officer who had nodded to her the day before. "Fräulein Hoffman," the officer called out in accented but passable German, "I'm Lieutenant Washington. I believe your father told you we'd be bringing some additional food supplies." Maria nodded, trying not to stare. She had seen black people before, performers in Berlin before the war, but never spoken to one. The Reich's propaganda had portrayed them as dangerous and primitive, but this officer was clearly neither. He was professional, well-spoken, and carried himself with dignity. "Yes, Lieutenant, we're grateful for any assistance," she replied in careful English. She had studied the language in school and was one of the few in town who spoke it with any fluency. Washington smiled, seeming pleased at her English. "We've brought corn," he said, gesturing to the sacks his men were unloading. "It's a staple food in America, especially in the southern states where many of us are from." Maria looked at the yellow kernels with confusion. "Maize. But this is what we feed to animals, not people." Washington's smile didn't falter, but something flashed in his eyes. "In America, it's prepared in many different ways for human consumption. It's nutritious and versatile." Before Maria could respond, she heard laughter behind her. Several older women, including the formidable Helga Zimmermann, had approached and overheard the conversation. "That's animal feed," Helga exclaimed loudly in German, making no effort to hide her disdain. "They expect us to eat what we give to pigs and chickens. First they bomb our homes and now they mock us with livestock food." Washington didn't need to understand the exact words to grasp their meaning. Maria flushed with embarrassment. "I apologize for—" she began, but Washington cut her off with a raised hand. "It's all right," he said calmly. "Cultural differences. Perhaps we could demonstrate how it's prepared." He turned to one of his men. "Corporal Davis, do we have any of that cornbread you made yesterday?" Davis nodded and returned to the truck, coming back with a cloth-wrapped package. He unwrapped it to reveal several golden-brown squares. The rich, warm smell wafted through the air, causing several onlookers to draw closer despite themselves. "This is cornbread," Washington explained. "Just one way we prepare corn. It's especially good with beans or stew." He broke off a piece and offered it to Maria. "Would you like to try?" Maria hesitated only briefly before accepting. Under the watchful eyes of the other women, she took a small bite. Her eyes widened in surprise. "It's good," she admitted. "Sweet and hearty." She took another bite, then addressed the other women in German. "It's actually quite delicious. Different, but good." Helga stepped forward, her skepticism evident. "Let me try this American curiosity," she said in German, then repeated more simply in English. "I try." Washington handed her a piece. Helga examined it suspiciously before taking a tiny nibble. Her expression remained neutral, but she didn't spit it out, which seemed to surprise even her. She finished the piece in silence. "We can show you how to prepare it," Washington offered, "and other dishes made from corn. It might not be what you're used to, but in times like these, beggars can't be choosers," Helga finished for him in heavily accented English, her tone somewhere between resignation and pragmatism, and so began an unexpected cultural exchange in the small Bavarian town of Burglengenfeld. What started as a simple food distribution would evolve into something more significant, a microcosm of the complex relationships forming in post-war Germany between occupiers and occupied, victors and vanquished, and between people separated by culture, experience and prejudice. The following day, Corporal Henry Davis found himself in the unusual position of teaching German women how to cook cornbread. The town's former school kitchen had been requisitioned for the purpose, and about a dozen women had gathered, some out of genuine interest, others clearly there only for the promise of food. "My mama taught me this recipe when I was knee-high to a grasshopper," Davis explained as he mixed the ingredients. Maria translated, though Davis's expressive gestures made much of the process clear, even to those who didn't understand English. "First, you mix your dry ingredients, cornmeal, flour, some salt, baking powder." He demonstrated, measuring each with practiced ease. "Then your wet ingredients, milk, eggs if you have them, melted fat." He looked up. "I know eggs and milk are scarce. You can make do without eggs, and water can substitute for milk if necessary." Helga Zimmermann watched with arms crossed. "In Germany, we had proper bread before the war," she commented in German. "Dense rye bread that sustained you, not this. Cake." After Maria translated, Davis smiled. "Yes, ma'am, I've tried your German bread. It's good too. Different tools for different jobs. Where I'm from in Georgia, cornbread goes with everything." As Davis continued his demonstration, mixing the batter and pouring it into a greased pan, more questions emerged from the women. "Why do your people eat this corn when white Americans eat wheat bread?" one woman asked. Her question reflecting the Nazi propaganda that had portrayed black Americans as primitive. Davis paused and the kitchen grew quiet. He looked at the woman steadily. "All Americans eat corn, ma'am. White, black, doesn't matter. But it's true that in the South, where many black folks live, corn is especially common. It grows well there." He deliberately didn't mention that the South's corn-heavy diet was partly a legacy of poverty and slavery. "In America," he continued, "we have food from all over the world. Italian pasta, German sausages, Irish potatoes, Jewish bagels, Chinese dishes. That's what makes America what it is. We take things from everywhere and make them our own." As Davis slid the pan into the oven, Technical Sergeant Marcus Johnson arrived with another sack of corn. "Ladies," he greeted them with a nod, "I brought something else you might find interesting." From his pocket, he produced a small paper bag. "Popcorn." "Pop." "Corn?" repeated Maria, confused by the unfamiliar term. Johnson grinned. "You'll see." He borrowed a large pot with a lid, added a small amount of oil and the special corn kernels, and placed it over the heat. As the oil heated, he kept the pot moving. "My father owned a small movie theater back home," Johnson explained as he worked. "Before the war, I helped run it. Popcorn was our biggest seller, more profitable than the movie tickets sometimes." The women watched with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Then suddenly a popping sound came from the pot, then another. Then a rapid-fire series of pops that made several women jump. Johnson, clearly enjoying their reaction, continued shaking the pot until the popping slowed. When he removed the lid with a flourish, the transformation was remarkable. What had been small, hard yellow kernels was now a pot full of fluffy white morsels. He sprinkled them with a little salt from his rations. "Popcorn," he announced, "America's favorite movie snack." The women approached cautiously. Maria was the first to try a piece. It's like eating air," she exclaimed. "But crunchy." Even Helga seemed intrigued by this apparent magic trick. She tried a piece, then another. Interesting was all she would admit. But she continued eating. While the cornbread baked and the women sampled the popcorn, Johnson engaged them in conversation. "What was it like here during the war?" he asked. "If you don't mind talking about it." The question hung in the air for a moment. Such direct discussion of the war was still uncomfortable territory. After Maria translated, there was a long pause before anyone spoke. Finally, a middle-aged woman named Greta answered. "Hungry. We were always hungry, especially the last 2 years. Everything went to the front. Food, clothing, metal. Even church bells were melted down for bullets." Johnson nodded. "Food was rationed in America too, but not like here. We had enough. We heard American soldiers had chocolate and real coffee," another woman said. "We haven't tasted real coffee in years." "That's true," Johnson acknowledged. "We had chocolate bars in our rations." He reached into his pocket and broke a chocolate D-ration bar into small pieces. "Not the best chocolate, but it's real." He passed the pieces around, watching as the women savored them. "Our leaders told us Americans lived in luxury while plotting Germany's destruction," Helga said after tasting the chocolate. "I see now at least part of that was true. You did live in luxury compared to us." Johnson considered this. "I wouldn't call it luxury, Mom. But we didn't have cities being bombed either, that's true." He paused. "Except for Pearl Harbor. And we were told you would kill us all when you arrived," a younger woman added quietly. "That especially the Negro soldiers would do terrible things." An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Johnson's expression remained carefully neutral. "Propaganda on both sides, I guess," he finally said. "We heard things about Germans too." The timer for the cornbread rang, breaking the tension. Davis removed the golden brown bread from the oven, its aroma filling the small kitchen. He cut it into squares and distributed it while still warm. "Best way to eat it," he declared. "Fresh from the oven." The women's reactions varied. Some were openly appreciative, others more reserved, but all ate their portions. Davis had also prepared a simple bean stew showing how the cornbread could be used to soak up the liquid. "Tomorrow," he announced, "I'll show you how to make corn porridge, what we call grits. And Sergeant Johnson here knows how to make corn on the cob when fresh corn is available." As the women departed with their recipes and small sacks of cornmeal, Maria stayed behind to help clean up. "Thank you," she said to Davis, "not just for the food, but for being kind. Some of the other American soldiers." "Sam, I'm not so polite," Davis finished for her. "Yes, I know, war makes men hard. Occupation isn't easy for either side." Maria nodded. "May I ask you something personal?" "Depends on the question," Davis replied with a cautious smile. "Why do you fight for America when—" She hesitated, searching for delicate wording. "When America doesn't treat us equally," Davis supplied. His smile faded. "It's complicated, Fräulein Hoffmann. America has its problems, serious ones, but it's still my country. My father fought in the last war, and his father was a slave who fought for the Union to end slavery." He looked her directly in the eyes. "I fight for what America could be, not just what it is." Maria absorbed this. "I understand that feeling," she said quietly, "to believe in what your country could be." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Washington. "How did our cooking class go?" he asked. "Successful, I think, sir," Davis replied, "though I'm not sure we've completely convinced them that corn isn't just for livestock." Washington laughed. "It's a start. Rome wasn't built in a day." He turned to Maria. "Fräulein Hoffmann, I wanted to discuss something with you. Your father mentioned you worked as a teacher before the school was damaged in the artillery barrage." Maria nodded. "Yes, I taught English and literature. We're establishing a civilian food program, And we need someone to coordinate distribution and education on preparing unfamiliar foods. Your father suggested you might be interested. Maria looked surprised. You want me to work for the American forces? With us, Washington corrected. For your community. The reality is, Germany will be receiving substantial American food aid in the coming months. Much of it will include foods unfamiliar to Germans, not just corn, but other American staples. Someone needs to help bridge that gap. Maria considered this. Working with the occupiers would be seen as collaboration by some. Yet the need was real. Her people were hungry. I would be paid? She asked practically. Yes, both in currency and additional rations. Maria squared her shoulders. Then I accept. Over the next several weeks, the corn cooking demonstrations expanded to include other American foods that were beginning to arrive as part of relief shipments. German civilians, initially skeptical, became increasingly receptive as hunger overcame prejudice. Lieutenant Washington established a regular meeting with Burgermeister Hoffman and other local leaders to coordinate food distribution and other recovery efforts. Though tensions remained, this was, after all, an occupation following a bitter war. A working relationship developed. For the men of the 761st, the assignment brought mixed feelings. They were still segregated from white units, still facing racism from some white American soldiers, and still struggling with their complex position as representatives of a country that denied them full citizenship. Yet many found meaning in the humanitarian aspects of their current mission. One evening in early June, as the summer twilight lingered over the town, Corporal Davis was supervising the unloading of a new shipment when he noticed a small commotion near the town square. A group of German children had surrounded Sergeant Johnson, who appeared to be showing them something. Davis approached to find Johnson demonstrating how to play jacks with a set he had somehow acquired. The children, ranging from about 6 to 12 years old, watched with fascination. Picked these up in a package from home, Johnson explained when he saw Davis. Figured these kids could use some play in their lives. Davis nodded. The children of Burglengenfeld, like children throughout Germany, had known little but war for most of their lives. Many had lost fathers, siblings, or other family members. Play was a luxury in short supply. "Gut!" exclaimed one small boy, as he successfully scooped up 3 jacks. His malnourished frame and too large clothes couldn't diminish his smile. Johnson ruffled the boy's hair. "That's right, Gut." He looked up at Davis. "Kids are the same everywhere, aren't they?" Before Davis could respond, an angry voice cut through the scene. A man in his 50s, his right sleeve pinned up where an arm should have been, approached rapidly. "Get away from them," he shouted in German, grabbing the nearest child and pulling her back. "Get away from our children!" Johnson rose slowly to his feet, his expression carefully neutral despite the man's obvious hostility. Maria, who had been passing by with a basket of vegetables, hurried over to translate and mediate. "Herr Müller," she addressed the man, "Sergeant Johnson was just teaching the children a game." "I don't want these. These soldiers near our children," Müller insisted, switching to broken English. "Not enough they bomb our homes, take our country. Now they take minds of our children." A small crowd had begun to gather. Davis noticed Lieutenant Washington approaching from the direction of headquarters, his face concerned. "Sir," Davis called, "just a misunderstanding about a game of jacks." Washington assessed the situation quickly. "Herr Müller," he said, recognizing the man from previous community meetings, "I understand your concerns." "You understand nothing," Müller spat. "You come here, give children candy, teach games like saviors. But where were American saviors when our cities burned? When our women and children died under your bombs?" The accusation hung in the air. It was a question without a satisfactory answer. The strategic bombing of German cities had indeed killed countless civilians, a harsh reality of total war. Washington didn't flinch. "The war brought suffering to everyone it touched, Herr Müller. We can't change that. But these children deserve whatever moments of joy they can find now. From you, from Schwarze?" Müller used the German word for blacks, his tone making the word an insult. "Our Führer warned us about your kind." At this, several Americans stiffened, but Washington held up a hand to keep his men calm. "Your Führer led Germany to ruin," Washington replied evenly. "Perhaps it's time to reconsider what else he may have been wrong about." A tense silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, one of the children, a girl of about 10, stepped forward and tugged on Müller's remaining arm. "Onkel Fritz," she said, "they gave us popcorn yesterday and it popped like magic. Why can't we play their game?" The simple question, delivered with a child's innocence, seemed to deflate some of Müller's anger. He looked down at his niece, then around at the other children, whose expressions ranged from fear to confusion to disappointment. "These children have seen enough hatred," Washington said quietly. "Haven't they?" Müller's jaw worked as he struggled with conflicting emotions. Finally, he muttered something in German and stalked away, leaving the children behind. Maria translated for the Americans. He said to be home before dark. The tension gradually dissipated as Johnson resumed the game and the crowd dispersed. Washington drew Davis aside. "We'll face more of that," he said, watching as the children returned to their play. "The wounds are too fresh." Davis nodded. "Yes, sir. But that little girl, did you see how she stood up to him? Maybe there's hope for the next generation." "Maybe," Washington agreed, "if we give them reason to see beyond what they've been taught." He glanced at his watch. "I'm meeting with Colonel Jenkins in 20 minutes. Apparently there's news from home I should be aware of." Later that evening, Washington gathered his officers in the small room he used as an office. His expression was somber as he relayed what he had learned. "There have been racial incidents back home," he began, "in several cities. As Negro veterans return, there's been tension. In some cases, violence." The men exchanged glances. They had feared this. Many had harbored private hopes that their service, their sacrifices, would somehow transform America's racial dynamics. It was a hope tempered by realism, but hope nonetheless. "Details, sir?" asked Lieutenant Robert Freeman, Washington's executive officer. "Limited. There was a serious incident in Columbia, Tennessee in February. A confrontation between a white store clerk and a Negro veteran and his mother. It escalated into wider violence. There have been other smaller incidents elsewhere." The men absorbed this in silence. "So nothing's changed," Sergeant Johnson finally said, his voice flat. Washington chose his words carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight. We're fighting a different kind of battle now, proving through our actions what we're capable of." He paused. "Colonel Jenkins specifically mentioned that headquarters is pleased with how we've handled our duties here. That matters." "With all due respect, sir," Davis said, "it matters more how they treat us when we get home." Washington couldn't argue with that. "All we can do is continue to serve with honor. The rest—" He left the thought unfinished. The men dispersed, each carrying the weight of this reminder that their fight for dignity wouldn't end with the war. For Washington, it underscored the complexity of their position, representing an imperfect democracy to a defeated people who were themselves grappling with the consequences of their nation's dark chapter. The following day brought a new development. A small delegation of local farmers requested a meeting with the American command. Washington was asked to attend due to his growing rapport with the community. The farmers, led by a weathered man named Heinrich Bauer, had a proposal. They wanted to plant corn. "We have seen that this American grain grows well in many conditions," Bauer explained through Maria's translation. "We have fields that have been damaged by tanks and artillery. The soil is disturbed, not ideal for our traditional crops, but perhaps corn would grow there." Washington was surprised by the request. "We can provide some seed corn," he said, "but do you know how to cultivate it?" Bauer nodded. "Before the war, I spent 2 years working on farms in America, in Iowa. I know something of corn cultivation." This revelation startled Washington. "You worked in America? You never mentioned this." Bauer's expression hardened slightly. It was not wise during the Nazi years to speak of positive experiences in America. Colonel Jenkins, who was leading the meeting, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Herr Bauer?" "A test planting on 5 hectares. If successful, we expand next season. The current wheat crop will be poor. The war disrupted planting times, and many fields are damaged. We need alternatives." Jenkins looked to Washington. "Lieutenant, your thoughts?" Washington considered it. Corn requires different equipment for harvesting than what they're used to, but it could work. and it would reduce their dependence on imported food sooner. Very well, Jenkins decided. We'll arrange for seed corn and any technical advice needed. He fixed Bauer with a steady gaze. Consider this an experiment in cooperation, Herr Bauer. As the meeting concluded, Washington found himself walking alongside Bauer. You really worked in Iowa? He asked. Bauer nodded. From 1928 to 1930, the Schultz family farm near Cedar Rapids. A hint of something like nostalgia crossed his face. Good people, hard workers. I learned much there. Then you've eaten corn before. You knew it wasn't just animal feed. Bauer's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Yes, but many Germans do not know this. It was easier to go along. Washington understood the implications. Under the Nazi regime, admitting familiarity with American customs, especially positive experiences, could have been dangerous. It was safer to pretend ignorance or disdain. The world is changing, Herr Bauer, Washington said. Perhaps now is the time for truth. Bauer regarded him thoughtfully. Perhaps. But change comes hard to old men like me. He paused. In Iowa, I worked alongside a Negro man. Samuel was his name. Best farmer I ever met. He could look at the sky, feel the soil, and know exactly when to plant. Another pause. I had not thought of Samuel in many years, until your men came to our town. With that cryptic comment, Bauer nodded farewell and walked away, leaving Washington to wonder how many other Germans had hidden histories, knowledge and experiences that contradicted the Nazi worldview they had been forced to adopt. By mid-July, the first experimental corn crop was growing on the outskirts of Burglengenfeld. The green stalks stood nearly waist-high, their growth vigorous despite the somewhat depleted soil. For the German farmers, it was a novelty, a crop unlike the wheat, rye, and barley they traditionally cultivated. The corn project had expanded beyond mere cultivation. Maria Hoffman had organized regular cooking demonstrations where women shared recipes and techniques. What had begun as a necessity, learning to prepare unfamiliar American food aid, had evolved into a genuine cultural exchange. One warm afternoon, Lieutenant Washington was invited to observe one such demonstration. He arrived at the community kitchen to find it buzzing with activity. About 20 women, ranging from teenagers to grandmothers, were gathered around tables where various corn dishes were being prepared. To his surprise, it wasn't just his men demonstrating American recipes. German women were sharing their own adaptations. Cornmeal dumplings in traditional German soups, corn added to potato pancakes, and other hybrid creations. Helga Zimmermann, once the most vocal skeptic of animal feed, was now showing younger women how to make a corn and apple strudel of her own invention. "Lieutenant," Maria greeted him, "what do you think? We've created quite the Corn Academy, haven't we?" Washington smiled. "I'm impressed. It seems corn has been fully accepted." "Not just accepted, embraced," Maria corrected. "Necessity is a powerful motivator, but beyond that, people have discovered they actually enjoy it." Washington wandered among the tables, sampling dishes and exchanging pleasantries. He noticed that several of the recipes had been written down in a communal notebook, a humble beginning of cultural preservation. "We're documenting everything," Maria explained when she saw him examining the notebook. "For future generations," she lowered her voice. "And I've been thinking, perhaps when things are more stable, we could publish a small cookbook, German-American cuisine or something similar." The idea struck Washington as remarkably optimistic, looking toward a future where Germans and Americans might share cultural connections rather than enmity. "I think that's an excellent idea," he said. As he was preparing to leave, Washington overheard a conversation between two women that caught his attention. "My Hans writes from the American zone that they're rebuilding factories already," one woman was saying in German. "He says there's talk of a major economic reconstruction program." "The Americans can afford it," the other replied. "They have everything, food, machinery, money." "It makes one wonder why we believed we could defeat them. Their trucks alone, have you noticed? All different models, all new, when our army could barely find fuel for their few remaining vehicles." The first woman nodded. "The Soviets may have endless men, but the Americans have endless everything else." Washington, understanding enough German to follow the gist of their conversation, found it telling. The material superiority of American forces was having its psychological effect. The women weren't discussing ideology or even military prowess, but the sheer industrial might that had overwhelmed Germany. This observation was reinforced later that week when Washington accompanied a supply convoy to a neighboring town. Along the way, they passed a column of German prisoners being transported to a work detail. The contrast was stark. The Americans in their well-maintained trucks, the Germans on foot, their uniforms tattered and their frames gaunt. One of the MPs escorting the prisoners, a Sergeant Williams from another unit, fell into conversation with Washington during a brief stop. "These fellas can't believe our supply situation," Williams remarked, nodding toward the prisoners. "One of them, an officer who speaks English, told me they'd been told America was on the verge of economic collapse, that we couldn't possibly sustain a war effort. Then they see our equipment, our food. It's a shock to their system." Washington nodded. "Propaganda works until reality intrudes." "That's the truth," Williams agreed. "You should hear what they say about you boys in the 761st, though." He glanced around to make sure no prisoners were within earshot. Their officers were told Negro troops were undisciplined, couldn't fight effectively, would break under pressure. Then your battalion comes rolling through with Patton, kicking ass and taking names. Washington allowed himself a small smile. "We had something to prove." "And proved it you did," Williams replied. "These Krauts don't know what to think now. Their whole worldview's been turned upside down." This conversation stayed with Washington as the summer progressed. He began to notice more signs of the psychological adjustment happening among the German population. A gradual recognition that many of their fundamental assumptions had been wrong. It manifested in various ways. German technicians expressed amazement at American equipment, not just its abundance, but its quality and innovation. Former Wehrmacht officers, now assisting with reconstruction efforts, were astonished by American logistics capabilities, and ordinary civilians were increasingly willing to question what they had been told by their former leaders. An opportunity to observe this transformation more directly came in August, when Washington was invited to attend a town meeting where Burgermeister Hoffman would discuss plans for rebuilding the local school. The meeting was held in the town hall with about 50 citizens in attendance. As Washington entered, accompanied by Corporal Davis as his aide, he noticed the room fall silent. Though the townspeople had grown somewhat accustomed to American presence, it was still unusual for black officers to attend civic functions. Burgermeister Hoffman nodded to them. "Lieutenant Washington and Corporal Davis will be observing today," he announced in German, with Maria translating for the Americans. "The American forces have offered materials for the school reconstruction, and Lieutenant Washington is their liaison for this project." The meeting proceeded with discussions of practical matters: construction schedules, material allocations, arrangements for temporary classrooms until the building was complete. Washington noticed that Hoffman was a capable administrator, methodical and thorough. During a discussion about the school curriculum, however, a heated debate erupted. The issue was what history would be taught, and how recent events would be presented. "We cannot simply erase the past 12 years, argued an elderly man who had been identified as a former teacher. "For better or worse, it is our history." "No one is suggesting erasure," Hoffman replied, "but we must be truthful about what occurred and why. The new generation must understand the mistakes that were made." A middle-aged woman rose. "And who decides what the truth is? The Americans? The victors always write history." The debate grew more intense, with various factions arguing for approaches ranging from avoiding recent history entirely to teaching an unvarnished account of Nazi crimes. Finally, a quiet voice spoke from the back of the room. It belonged to a thin man whom Washington recognized as Dr. Müller, a local physician who had treated both Germans and American personnel since the occupation began. "I visited Dachau last month," Dr. Müller said, and the room fell silent. "I went as a medical consultant when they needed additional doctors to treat the survivors." He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking much older. "What I saw there, what was done in our name, that is the truth that must be taught. Not to shame our children, but to ensure they never allow such things to happen again." A heavy silence fell over the room. The concentration camps had been a rumor, a whispered possibility for many Germans during the war. Now, with survivors emerging and Allied documentation, the horrible reality was becoming impossible to deny. Washington watched the faces of the townspeople, seeing a range of emotions: shame, disbelief, anger, grief. It was a community struggling to reconcile their national identity with crimes committed in their name. Dr. Miller continued, his voice gaining strength. "We cannot build a new Germany on lies. Whether comfortable or uncomfortable, our children must know the truth. All of it, the good and the terrible." The meeting eventually moved on to other topics, but the emotional impact of Dr. Muller's words lingered. As Washington and Davis left the town hall, they discussed what they had witnessed. "It's a different kind of courage," Washington observed, "facing uncomfortable truths about your own people." Davis nodded. "Makes you wonder how America will reckon with its own uncomfortable truths someday." The comment gave Washington pause. The parallel wasn't perfect. The scale and nature of Nazi crimes were unique in their horror, but America too had aspects of its history and present that required honest confrontation. "One step at a time, Corporal," he said finally. "One step at a time." By September, the experimental corn crop was reaching maturity, standing tall and golden in the autumn sunlight. The project had expanded, with Herr Bauer training other farmers in cultivation techniques. Plans were being made for a larger planting the following spring. The success of the corn project had broader implications. It represented a small but significant step towards self-sufficiency for the local population, a move away from complete dependence on American aid. It also symbolized something more intangible: adaptation and resilience in the face of changed circumstances. Lieutenant Washington found himself reflecting on these themes one evening as he walked along the Naab River. The war had been over for nearly 5 months, yet in many ways the real work was just beginning, rebuilding not just infrastructure, but trust, understanding, and a foundation for peace. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of children's laughter. Ahead, near the riverbank, a group of German children were playing with several soldiers from his unit. They appeared to be engaged in a game of baseball, using a makeshift bat and ball. Washington stopped to watch, struck by the scene. Just months ago, these children had been taught to fear Americans, especially black Americans, as dangerous enemies. Now they played together, the barriers of language and background temporarily forgotten in the universal language of sport. As he observed, Maria Hoffman approached, carrying a basket of vegetables from the community garden, another initiative that had emerged from the food security programs. "A nice sight, isn't it?" she said, following his gaze to the impromptu baseball game. Washington nodded. "More than nice. Important." "Children adapt quickly," Maria noted. "Adults, we carry more baggage." "Speaking of adaptation," Washington said, changing the subject, "I heard your corn cookbook project is proceeding well." Maria smiled. "Yes, we have nearly 30 recipes now. Frau Zimmermann is our most enthusiastic contributor, if you can believe it." Washington chuckled. "The same Frau Zimmermann who declared corn fit only for pigs?" "The very same. Now she insists her corn strudel is superior to traditional apple strudel, though she'd never admit it publicly." They walked together for a while, discussing various community projects. Washington had come to value Maria's insights. She understood her people and could anticipate resistance or acceptance to new ideas. As they neared the town, Maria's expression grew more serious. "Lieutenant, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "What will happen to you, to your men, when you return to America? Will things be different because of your service?" It was a question Washington had asked himself countless times. "I wish I knew," he answered honestly. "Some things will change, others won't, at least not quickly." "It seems unfair," Maria said quietly, "after all you've done." Washington considered his response carefully. "History moves in fits and starts, Fräulein Hoffmann. Sometimes progress comes slowly, other times in great leaps. The important thing is to keep pushing forward." He paused. "That's true for Germany as well." Maria nodded, understanding the parallel. "I have been thinking about what Dr. Muller said at the town meeting, about facing uncomfortable truths. It's difficult but necessary. For both our nations, Washington agreed. They parted at the town square, each carrying their own thoughts about history, justice, and the possibility of change. The next day brought news that would affect the men of the 761st, orders for their redeployment. They would be leaving Burglengenfeld in 2 weeks, replaced by regular occupation forces as part of a larger reorganization. For many in the unit, the news brought mixed emotions. They had established relationships in the community, seen the fruits of their efforts in various projects. Yet they were also eager to return home, despite the uncertainties that awaited them there. Washington gathered his officers to discuss the transition. "We need to ensure all our initiatives are properly handed over," he instructed, "especially the agricultural projects and food distribution systems." "What about the corn harvest, sir?" asked Lieutenant Freeman. "It's nearly ready. We'll accelerate it if necessary. I want our men to see the results of what they helped start." The news of their departure spread quickly through the town, eliciting varied reactions. Some Germans were anxious about what the change would mean for the established programs. Others, still uncomfortable with occupation in any form, were indifferent or quietly pleased. For Herr Bauer and his fellow farmers, the timing was fortunate. The corn harvest could proceed with the 761st still present to advise and assist. Arrangements were made for a harvesting demonstration, where Bauer would show traditional German farmers the techniques he had learned in Iowa years before. The demonstration drew a substantial crowd. German farmers watched with professional interest as the tall stalks were cut and the ears of corn collected. Children ran between the rows, helping gather the harvest and marveling at the size of the ears. Bauer, usually taciturn, became almost animated as he explained the process. "The yield is good," he announced after assessing several sections of the field, "better than I expected for a first planting in this soil." Washington, who had come to observe, nodded appreciatively. "Your experience in Iowa served you well, Herr Bauer." "Perhaps," Bauer acknowledged. He hesitated, then added, "When I returned from America in 1930, I tried to suggest corn cultivation to my father. He rejected it, said it was not for Germans, that we had our own ways." His weathered face showed a hint of satisfaction. He was wrong. Adaptation is strength, not weakness. It was a profound statement from the practical farmer, an implicit rejection of the rigid nationalism that had dominated German thinking for so long. Washington recognized it as part of the larger philosophical reckoning happening throughout the country. As the harvest continued, a small ceremony took shape spontaneously. Maria organized the women to prepare several corn dishes, both American recipes taught by the soldiers and the German adaptations that had evolved over the summer. Tables were set up at the edge of the field, and a modest harvest celebration began. Colonel Jenkins arrived with several other officers to observe the successful project. He seemed impressed by what he saw. "Good work, Lieutenant," he told Washington as they surveyed the scene. "When this started, I had my doubts. Seems your corn diplomacy has borne fruit, or grain, as it were." Washington acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "The credit goes to the Germans who were willing to try something new, sir, and to my men who approached the task with respect rather than condescension." Jenkins studied him for a moment. "You know, Washington, there's talk of expanding these agricultural initiatives to other regions. Your experience here could be valuable." "Sir, I've recommended you for a position with the Occupation Government's Agricultural Advisory Team. If you're interested, you could extend your deployment, work on implementing similar programs elsewhere in our zone." The offer caught Washington by surprise. It would mean delaying his return to America, to his family in Virginia, and whatever civilian future awaited him there. Yet it also represented an opportunity to build on what they'd accomplished in Burglengenfeld. "I'll consider it, sir," he replied. "May I ask about my men?" "Those who wish to volunteer for extended deployment could potentially join you. Others would return with the battalion as scheduled." Washington nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for the opportunity, Colonel. I'll have an answer for you tomorrow." That evening, Washington discussed the offer with his closest officers, Freeman, Johnson, and Davis. Their reactions varied. "It's a recognition of what we've accomplished," Freeman observed, "and a chance to do more." Johnson was more skeptical. "Or a convenient way to keep us in Europe rather than dealing with us back home." "Either way," Davis said, "it's a choice we didn't have before, that's something." Washington listened to their perspectives, weighing the complex factors involved. "I need to think about it," he told them. "Each of you should do the same, decide what's best for your own futures." Later, unable to sleep, Washington walked through the quiet town. The streets were dark, electricity was still unreliable, but the nearly full moon provided enough light to navigate. He found himself at the town square, where a few months earlier he had witnessed the confrontation between Herr Müller and Sergeant Johnson over a simple game of jacks. "Lieutenant Washington?" a voice called softly. It was Maria Hoffman, also apparently unable to sleep. "Is everything all right?" "Just thinking, Fräulein Hoffman. We received our redeployment orders today." "Yes, I heard." She hesitated. "You will be missed." Washington smiled slightly. "By some, perhaps. More than you might think," she assured him. "What my father said at dinner tonight. Many feel the same way." "Oh? What did he say?" Maria seemed to choose her words carefully. "That of all the changes this war has brought, having our perceptions challenged was perhaps the most valuable." She paused. "The Negro soldiers were supposed to be our inferiors. That's what we were taught. Instead, you proved to be among the most disciplined, the most compassionate, the most human of our occupiers." Washington absorbed this. "And does your father speak for many?" "Not all, Dad," she admitted, "but more than would have been possible 6 months ago. Minds are changing, Lieutenant. Slowly, but they are changing." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, looking up at the stars. "I've been offered a position with the Agricultural Advisory Team," Washington finally said, "to implement similar programs elsewhere in the American zone." Maria looked at him with surprise. "Will you accept?" "I'm not sure yet. There are considerations." "Your family back home?" "Yes. And complicated feelings about extending my time in uniform." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Whatever you decide, what happened here matters. The cornfields will remain. The cookbook will be published. The children who played baseball with your men will remember." Her words resonated with Washington. Whatever larger historical forces were at work, whatever systemic challenges remained both in Germany and America, these small human connections had value. They were seeds planted that might grow in unexpected ways. The following day, as Washington continued to contemplate his decision, a small delegation arrived at American headquarters. It consisted of Burgermeister Hoffman, Herr Bauer, and to everyone's surprise, Fritz Müller, the one-armed veteran who had so angrily confronted Sergeant Johnson months earlier. They requested a meeting with Colonel Jenkins and Lieutenant Washington. Once assembled in Jenkins' office, Hoffman acted as spokesman. "Colonel, Lieutenant, we understand the 761st Battalion will be departing soon," he began. "Before you go, we wish to express our gratitude for your specific contributions to our community's recovery." Jenkins looked skeptical. "That's appreciated, Burgermeister," Hoffman continued. "In particular, the agricultural initiatives have been transformative. Herr Bauer estimates the corn crop will provide nearly 30% of our local grain needs this winter, a significant reduction in our dependence on aid." Bauer nodded confirmation. "The yield has exceeded expectations, and we have seed stock for a larger planting next season. Furthermore," Hoffman added, "the cooking education program organized by my daughter has been invaluable in helping our population adapt to unfamiliar foods. The community kitchen now serves over 200 meals daily, incorporating American ingredients in ways our people find acceptable." Washington listened with interest, wondering what had prompted this formal acknowledgement. His question was answered when Müller stepped forward. "I have something to add," the veteran said, his voice gruff. He stood stiffly, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "I was wrong." A silence fell over the room. No one had expected this from the man who had been among the most openly hostile to the American presence. "About what, Herr Müller?" Washington asked gently. "About you. Your men." Müller struggled visibly with his pride. "I believed what we were told that Negroes were." He stopped, unable to repeat the dehumanizing propaganda. "I was wrong," he said again, more firmly this time. Washington maintained his composure, though inwardly he was moved by the man's difficult admission. "Thank you for saying so, Herr Müller. That cannot have been easy." Müller gave a curt nod. "My niece, the girl who wanted to play jacks that day, She told me I was being the very thing I claim to hate, someone who judges others without knowledge. His mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Children can be painfully direct. Colonel Jenkins, seemingly impressed by this unexpected development, leaned forward. Gentlemen, I appreciate your coming here today. Lieutenant Washington has been offered a position that would allow him to implement similar programs elsewhere in our zone. Your testimonial reinforces the value of that work. Hoffman looked at Washington with new interest. You would stay in Germany. I'm still considering the offer, Washington replied. Then consider this as well, Hoffman said. What you and your men have done here. It goes beyond food security. You've shown us an America different from what we expected. That has value beyond measure. The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, but the words stayed with Washington as he finalized his decision. That evening he informed Colonel Jenkins that he would accept the position with the Agricultural Advisory Team. Several of his men, including Sergeant Johnson and Corporal Davis, volunteered to extend their deployments as well. The final days of the 761st's presence in Burglengenfeld were busy with preparations for their departure and the handover of various projects to their replacements. A farewell gathering was organized at the community kitchen, where German and American dishes were served side by side, a tangible symbol of the cultural exchange that had occurred. As Washington surveyed the scene, Americans and Germans sharing meals, conversation, even laughter, he reflected on how far they had come from that first day when Helga Zimmermann had scoffed at corn as animal feed. Maria approached, carrying a package wrapped in cloth. A parting gift, she said, presenting it to him. The first copy of our cookbook. Washington unwrapped it to find a hand-bound collection of recipes, beautifully illustrated with hand-drawn pictures of various dishes. The title, written in both German and English, read, More Than Animal Feed, German-American Cuisine for a New Beginning. It's beautiful, Washington said, genuinely touched. Thank you. It will be distributed to other communities, Maria explained. A small piece of Burglengenfeld's experience that can help others. Washington nodded appreciatively. The best kind of propaganda, the kind based on truth and shared experience. As the evening wore on, Washington found himself in conversation with Herr Bauer, discussing plans for the next season's corn planting. I have written to the Schultz family in Iowa, Bauer mentioned casually, after all these years. Really? What did you tell them? That they were right about corn, Bauer said with the hint of a smile, and that I met some American soldiers who reminded me of the good things I had forgotten about your country. Before Washington could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Fritz Müller, who approached somewhat hesitantly. Lieutenant, Müller began, my niece wishes to say goodbye, if you have a moment. Washington followed Müller to where the young girl waited. She looked up at him with solemn eyes. Danke, she said simply, then added in carefully practiced English, Thank you for the games. You're welcome, Washington replied, crouching to her level. Keep practicing. Maybe someday you'll visit America and play games with children there. The girl's eyes widened at the thought. Is that possible? Anything is possible, Washington told her, believing it in that moment. The world was changing, painfully, imperfectly, but changing nonetheless. Old certainties were giving way to new possibilities. Prejudices were being challenged by direct experience. As the farewell gathering began to wind down, Washington found himself standing beside Colonel Jenkins, both men watching as German and American personnel said their goodbyes. You know, Jenkins said thoughtfully, when they write the history of this occupation, they probably won't mention corn. Washington smiled. No, sir, probably not. But sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. Cultural understanding doesn't always come from grand policies or declarations. Sometimes it comes from sharing a meal. Or laughing at a joke, Washington added. Or playing a game of baseball with children. Jenkins nodded. In any case, Lieutenant, you've done good work here. I expect you'll do more in your new role. I'll do my best, sir. The next morning, as the main body of the 761st prepared to depart, a crowd gathered to see them off. It wasn't the entire town. There were still many who viewed the Americans as unwelcome occupiers, but it was a substantial group, larger than Washington had expected. He stood with the small contingent who would be remaining, watching as his comrades loaded onto trucks. There were handshakes, promises to write, the usual rituals of military partings. As the convoy prepared to move out, Washington noticed something unexpected. Many of the German onlookers were holding small paper bags. As the trucks started their engines, these bags were opened, revealing popcorn, a farewell gesture that brought smiles to the faces of the departing soldiers. It was a small thing, perhaps insignificant in the grand sweep of history, but for Lieutenant James Washington, it represented something profound, a bridge across differences, a moment of shared humanity in the aftermath of humanity's darkest chapter. The convoy departed, leaving Washington and his small team to continue the work they had begun. The cornfields stood golden in the autumn sun, ready for harvest, a visible reminder that even in damaged soil, new growth was possible. In the months and years that followed, the agricultural initiatives expanded throughout the American occupation zone. Corn became a common crop in parts of Germany where it had never been grown before. The cookbook that began in Burglengenfeld was widely distributed, helping Germans incorporate unfamiliar American foods into their traditional cuisine. These developments rarely made headlines. They weren't as dramatic as the Berlin Airlift or the Marshall Plan or the other major policies that would shape post-war Europe, but they were part of the ground-level changes that gradually transformed former enemies into allies. For the men of the 761st who had participated in this quiet work, it provided a sense of purpose beyond combat, a demonstration that they could build as well as destroy, connect as well as conquer. Many would carry these experiences back to America, where they would join the growing civil rights movement with a deepened understanding of how prejudice could be overcome through direct human connection. And in a small Bavarian town, where corn now grew in fields once damaged by war, the story was told of how Black American soldiers had taught German women to transform what they had dismissed as animal feed into nourishing meals that helped their community survive the difficult post-war years. It was a story not of grand heroism, but of simple human adaptation, of minds changed not through force or argument, but through shared experience and mutual need. A story that reminded future generations that transformation often begins not with dramatic events, but with small everyday interactions. A shared meal, a game with children, a moment of unexpected kindness. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.